Hey guys, kinggath here with Bethesda Mod School. In this lesson, I'm going to show you how to set up a settings holotape. So this is going to be a combination of creation kit work and scripting. So I'm going to show you how to do script fragments. I'm going to show you how to set up terminals, holotapes, and lastly, I'm going to show you how to set up an item to drop directly into the player's inventory when they first load your mod up. Now this is something I actually despise when other mods do it, but occasionally there can be uses for it, and I know some people do prefer it in their mods, and I'm not here to judge that. If you want to do that, so be it. I do want to teach you how to do it in a way that will guarantee the player actually gets access to your item, because if you follow some people's methods that they figured out and you load up the mod at the beginning of the game with a new game, that item will actually get removed from the player's inventory after the pre-war sequence. And so I have a solution I like to use that gets around that, and so I thought I'd share that with you guys. So the first thing I want to do, and the reason we're in the game, is I'm going to go over a holotape, a settings holotape, and it doesn't do anything in particular. It's just a demonstration item, but there's a few things I want to show you guys that we're going to be doing with it, and like some different ways you can approach holotapes, because there's a lot of different ways you can kind of do these settings holotapes, and these are just some of the methods that I like to do. And I also thought I could demonstrate what some of these fields are going to do. So as you can see up at the top there, I've got header text field, welcome text field, so you can see where those would appear when we get to the creation kit and we actually start filling out things, so you can quickly see what that's going to look like. And then we've got the body text entry. But in general, there are two types of two ways you can do a setting in a holotape. So there's one which is toggleable, and this tends to be that and this doesn't necessarily need to be toggleable, but I guess what I meant by that was that the I should have named it differently, to be honest, is that the actual value of the option shows up right in the button itself. So you can see I've got toggleable option on, and then I can click it, and then it takes me to a display text about what that actually did. And you can see at the bottom there, it briefly said turning option off, and then it disappeared. And then when we come back to this main screen, now it's showing it correctly off, and then I can turn it back on, and now it shows on. So that's one way to do those. So by toggleable, I just meant that the actual the name or the value is in the name field. That's one way to do those. And another way, and this is a way that I like a lot for options that have a large number of choices to do, is to do what's called a subterminal. So basically we can click on this, and then you can see the different values that are available for this particular option. And then at the top there, you can see what the current value is. Now, none of this is something that's built in, supported by Bethesda, in the sense that there's not some easy template that you can copy to do these things. And so different people have approached these in different ways. I'm going to show you my way of approaching them. And there might actually be more things I'm not thinking of. There are other ways to approach even these two types, or maybe another type that I hadn't thought of. So if you guys think of any, or I have done any other types besides these two of showing the actual data right within the line of the option and then having it be a subterminal, if there's some third way that I'm not aware of. The only other third way I thought of while I was preparing this video was you could click on these and have a message box pop up, but that feels kind of disconnected. One of the things that the holotapes do for settings is they make it a very immersive way for you to deal with these things, but at the end of the day, setting up options to control gameplay is kind of unimmersive in itself, which is why, for the most part, if you're playing on PC, I think you prefer to have the MCM options, which is provided by that mod with F4SE. But for Xbox players and people who don't like to use F4SE or aren't comfortable using it, you're going to want to create a settings holotape no matter what. So if you're building a mod and you want players to be able to control things, you're going to need to do a settings holotape. Again, unless you're strictly going to support F4SE players and don't care about the rest, and in which case MCM support is probably the better way to go. But I personally like to do both, and will advocate for as much, and we'll probably teach you guys to do MCM at some point. But let's go ahead and head into the creation kit, and I'll show you how I set up this holotape, and we'll try and talk about it in real world uses, because obviously having something called toggleable option or complicated option is not particularly useful to the player. All right, so we're in the creation kit now, and we're going to set up our holotape. Now, before we actually do the holotape, there's one thing we need to talk about with holotapes, is that the holotape itself doesn't really hold any of the stuff the player does, because, like I said, the Bethesda doesn't have any of this stuff built in. You kind of have to do it all yourself, and we kind of created in the community ways to do this. But at the core, a holotape, all it really is a way to present various things in your inventory. So if you look at the fields of a random holotape, you'll see that it's got things like the model, the name you would see in your inventory, the sound that plays when you pick it up, and then the actual control that determines what the holotape does is this little type section. So when you're doing a holotape that can create the feel of a terminal, what you actually are doing is pointing the holotape to terminal records. So most of the work we're actually going to do is actually creating terminals. So I'm going to come back and do, the holotape actually last because it's such a simple thing, and you need to have the actual terminal entry you're going to point it to anyway for it to actually function. So we'll come and do that last. So we're going to start out with terminals. So the best way to do terminals, and terminals can be a pretty complicated topic, so I'm going to go over them as thoroughly as I can here, but I might skip a few little chunks just to avoid overwhelming you guys with what's going to be a pretty large data dump as is. So what I like to do is find a terminal that has default in the name already, because Bethesda has pretty much set up all of their different models so that we can speed this up. Now when you're doing holotapes, it doesn't actually matter which one you use, but I like to pick one that I might want to use in the future anyway, because occasionally it can be useful to set up a situation where the player can build your holotape as a terminal, because it does have a little more functionality than the Pip-Boy. For example, if you look at a mod like settlement management software, you'll notice that there is no holotape, and it actually is done all through a terminal, and that's because one of the things that terminals can do that the Pip-Boy can't with holotapes is text replacement, where you can actually see the names of things from in the game dynamically fill out fields, and you can't really do that with the Pip-Boy without F4SE. So I like to just pick a terminal that I think I would end up using. Now this is my favorite one, just the default terminal. I think this just works well. It's pretty much the most common one in the game, so it doesn't stand out like a sore thumb too much, and we can start with this. So we're going to go ahead and open it up, and as with everything else we do, we're going to change our ID field. We're going to start it with our prefix, and we'll just call this demo terminal main screen. Now, I like to put main somewhere in my first terminal entry, because what ends up happening in terminals generally is you find that there are multiple levels to them. There's different data as you start clicking on things, and that's especially the case when you get into settings holotapes, especially if you want to have multiple levels to break up your settings. If you get into any of the level of complexity, like something like Sim Settlements, where you've just got so many options that putting them all on one screen would be a pain. Or if you want to do, like in the demo, I showed you that complicated option where some of the options are kind of where you click in and then you get a list of all of the potential options right there to choose from. In that, you're going to end up having to do subterminals. So you're actually going to create multiple terminal records. And the main is what I consider the first screen. So that's the one that the holotape's going to actually point to. And so just making sure I have main in there just reminds me of that's where I'm going to point the holotape to. You could come up with your own naming scheme, but come up with something so that you remember which one is your first screen that your holotape should point at, so that when you go to set up your holotape, you know which terminal entry to point it to. So one of the nice things about using these defaults is it has a lot of the stuff configured that you would otherwise have to do manually. So I'm going to go ahead and hit new just so you can see the difference between a fresh terminal record and one that we copied a default. So as you can see, there's quite a few things of data filled out here. So our model fields are already done for us. The name, not important, but we've got all these keywords added here, and these keywords handle, the first two are tell the NPC or the player which animations to play on the character. The forced first person prevents the player from going into third person because they should be in first person to use the actual terminal. And then player path to furniture is when you use a terminal, you'll notice that your camera kind of does a little animation as if your character walked up and sat down at the terminal, and that's what that allows that to do. And then lastly, there's the interact point, which is set up to correctly align the NPC or player with the keyboard so that their body isn't just sunk into the floor or something. So a lot of this stuff gets set up for you automatically by duplicating a default terminal. So it just saves a little bit of time, which is another reason I like to use it. So we'll close out of this guy. Okay, so then if you saw in the CK in the demo video that I started with, I had a few of these things filled out in a way that was just to show you where they would appear on the screen. So for example, header text was at the very top. I think I just filled it in with the words header text field. If you leave this blank, I believe it gets filled in with something about Robco, which is the standard you see across the top of most terminals. Then welcome text is the next line that will show up directly below header text. In the demo I did, I think I had it saying welcome text field. Again, just showing you guys where this would appear, because that's something I often forget when I'm going in and designing my holotapes. So they practically have no real difference between header text and welcome text. It's just two different lines you can place at the very top of the screen. Then below those come the body text. So again, in my demo, I just had body text entries, what displays at the top of the terminal, blah, blah, blah. I just put in a bunch of information there so you can see what's going to come next. Now, the real difference between body text and something like welcome text, outside of the fact that it can do multi-line, so if we go ahead and right-click here and hit new, you get to fill in as much information as you want right here. So what's interesting about body text is that we can actually have multiple entries. So if we do first entry, and then we do second entry, what you can do is you can set up, if you click on one of these, you can go down to conditions here, and you can condition various things such as quest stages or what's happening in the game world for whatever reason. You can condition these in such a way that only one will appear, so that you control what text shows up below welcome text that the player can't interact with that's on the terminal. And this can be useful for various immersion things or just playing data to the player. For example, in some settlements, we use it to simulate an installation screen. So our first entry is a bunch of stuff that looks like a software's installing on the Pip-Boy. And then at the end of that, the OK button that'll be here, it runs a little script that changes a global variable. So that way, the next time the screen refreshes on that terminal, then it shows our second entry, which is our kind of header, our actual body message. So that our first one is just a little simulated install, and then the second one is what we actually want to show them every single time. So you can do interesting stuff like that with the body text because it can be conditioned. And we'll go into conditions a little bit in this video, but we're not going to go into super detail because conditions are such a massively complex topic, and they change depending on what you're using them on. There's different things you can do. So likely item conditions, this is something I'm probably going to cover in a ton of tutorials throughout this series. So you guys can just watch for more information over time. If you'd like to learn more about what you can do with conditions, a lot of the condition stuff is documented in the Skyrim section of the Creation Kit wiki, or a Creation Kit website. Yeah, I guess wiki, Creation Kit website. And you can also find a lot of examples throughout Bethesda stuff, because the item conditions is one of the most powerful features in the Creation Kit. So you can find a lot of information on those, just digging around and trying to emulate things you've seen before. So just for the sake of thoroughness, I'm going to go over a little bit more of what's on this screen so you know what some of this stuff is doing, even though we're not necessarily going to set it for this. So some of the fields we skipped up here, looping sound, if you were to select a sound file here, it would just play forever from the terminal as if the terminal had some sort of sound emulating from it. Maybe you want it to play like a static noise or something. Just be wary that it would probably drive the player nuts while they're trying to use your terminal, and not particularly useful in a holotape situation. Again, probably drive the player nuts. Destruction data, I haven't messed with this, but theoretically you could set up any item in the game to be destructible. We're not going to do obviously that. Checking in holds holotape. Just checking it in makes it so that that particular terminal can load a holotape. This is another one of those things where it doesn't affect ours because we're creating a holotape of it, so some of these settings aren't going to be relevant. And then you could also even pick a holotape from this list and have this terminal start with it in. I have no idea how that would react if you held a holotape within a terminal that you're using as part of a holotape. You might cause the game to explode. I don't know what that's for, but generally if you're building, I know what it's for, but I don't know how that would work in the holotape situation. But if you're building a terminal to just place in the game world, then you could set it up to start with a holotape in it. So for example, at the beginning of a new game in the vault, you'll find that there's a terminal with one of these, I think Atomic Command or one of those games baked right into it, and that's how they do that. Ignored by sandbox. Again, this is another one that doesn't get used by a holotape, but if you check that in, you can prevent NPCs from randomly wandering over and starting to use a terminal, which can sometimes be useful. Papyrus scripts, you can run various scripts. This is another one of those things. So you're going to find there's a pattern here. There's a lot of this stuff has no implication when used as a holotape, and Papyrus scripts is another one. If it were an actual terminal, this would be no different than adding a script to, say, a furniture or an activator object, which I don't believe we've covered much of, but we will in time. And so this would have to do more with this terminal actually existing in the world as opposed for a holotape. Again, actor values, exact same thing. This would have to do with the thing existing in the world. And that's the same even with these keywords. Most of this stuff up in this top area, outside of header text, welcome text, and then the body and menu items. Everything else on here is pretty much only going to be relevant to a terminal that's placed in the world. So actor value just is, I've covered this briefly when we did workshop items. These have a lot of powerful effects. They can basically allow you to set up different ways that that an item is tracked by the game world. And then these actor value and amount have to do with when you start filling out these fields. The interact point, again, we've talked about this with other furniture items. That has to do with where this blue marker will align so that the NPC knows where they should approach the thing. And then these make wall and make desk terminal are just shortcut buttons to set up this stuff quickly. So that's all those are for. Preview transform, you would only need to set that if you were making this thing buildable in workshop mode. Random animation start would just randomize the point at which the animation triggers for the NPC. So generally, the NPC will follow the exact same set of steps and start clicking away on the keyboard. And so if you had multiple of these in a row with NPCs all sitting in them already for some sort of scene, they would all be in sync by default. So using the random anim start is a way to avoid that. And then visible when distant. I haven't actually played around with this with terminals. My assumption is that you'd be able to see the data on the screen when you're a little bit far away, as opposed to it probably being clipped out. That would be cause performance issues. I don't think I've ever seen a terminal where that is checked in, but I could see maybe there being a reason for that if you needed to if you created some gigantic terminal screen, which we're not going to cover how to do. I've never tackled something like that, but maybe some gigantic terminal screen where it wouldn't make sense for the stuff that's on the screen to disappear when you walked away. So that's what that's for. And then the item conditions box over here changes depending on whether you're working with body text or menu items. All right, so that covers the whole terminal screen. We'll probably go into more detail of it when we start creating real world terminals in various lessons, but for the sake of the holotape, most of these are not going to be used. All right, so we talked about body text and that we can condition those. We're going to go ahead and just delete the second one. We don't need that. We don't actually even need this first entry here, but we'll just leave it for the sake of having a little bit in everything. And then by having only one, we don't need to worry about conditioning them. It's just going to show this one. I believe if you have multiple entries under here, that it's only going to show the first one that's conditions are true. So you could have a whole bunch of these and they wouldn't have any impact. Where you're actually going to see an impact having multiple things is under menu items. These are the lines of text that the player can actually select and make the terminal react accordingly. So if we go under here and we right click and press new, you will get the stuff here that's now ungrayed, and then this appears down here. So these are the things you can now interact with to set up this menu item. So we're going to start by setting up our toggleable option and show you guys how exactly we accomplish that. So it's really simple. It's really just a trick. So what we do is we type in the name of our option. So in the demo, we did toggleable option, and then we would actually put the value that we want it to have right here. And now I mentioned in the other video that toggleable option is kind of a weird way to phrase that. In reality, it should be something like inline value, but that just doesn't really sound like something real that most people have heard of. So, but the idea there is you're basically typing in the actual value that you want the player to see right in the item text here. So like I said, there is no way to do this by default. Bethesda hasn't created some template for us to use. This is just something a lot of us have done within the mod community to create these settings holotapes. So then what we would do to show the off position is we would just type the exact same thing again. So toggleable option and then off. And now all we're going to do is we're going to condition these two so that only one can ever show at any given time. And that's how you get that simulation that this option is changing as the player selects it. But before we go set up those conditions, let's talk about what some of these other things do. So response text is the text that appears at the bottom of the terminal screen. So I believe in the version I did in the demo, it says turning option off after you click it. So you would just type in here, and this is just for immersion's sake. It doesn't have any actual practical effect. It's just to give the player some feedback that something is happening here. You could also maybe type in a little explanation of what they're doing. The limit is that this will only remain on the screen for a couple of seconds, and so it can have it's not necessarily the best spot to put explanations, so I find it best to just use it for flavor and just kind of a confirmation to the player that what they selected actually happened. So then next to that is where you get to choose one of these things, one of these four things will determine what actually happens when you click on that option. So the first option here, submenu, is where you would select an additional terminal, and that would basically just jump the player into that terminal. So they would see all the content of that terminal instead of this one. So that's what we'll end up doing when we get to the complicated option. Then you've got the display text, and this is where I had shown in the other one, I had something that said like, this is what happens when you have display text. And it basically is a place you could set up an explanation for what the player did. That would be, I think, a better spot to do it than response text. The thing I don't love about display text is it adds an extra button that players have to push, because not only do they have to then wait for the text to all display, but then if they want to go back and change the option again, they've got to hit back. So I find it to be a little bit slower and a little clunkier feeling, but it is an option if you've got something that you're doing that's kind of complex and that you want to explain in a little more detail. So often you'll find on the item text line, it's going to be, very straightforward because you only get a limited amount of space. Whereas display text, it can be as long as you want, and it'll automatically create pages. So if you found particularly long, like journal entries or something in the game, those are using the display text, and they will create as many pages as are necessary for the player to be able to view all of that information. So you can put whatever you want in the display text. And then if we go back to submenu, it'll open up these two again. So then you have return to top level, which would basically pull you back out of submenus. So return to top level is something you could put. Maybe we add a new option on here obviously this is our main menu, so it wouldn't make sense to leave this in here. So I'll end up deleting it. But you could do something like on the as you dig into your subterminals, you could always have a main menu button that's return to top level, and that would just speed up the way the player would have access to get back to the front level if you end up going multiple levels deep. So return to top level does that. And then my favorite one is actually force redraw. And what force redraw does is it reevaluates all of the menu items and the body text for their conditions to see if anything should change what's being displayed. And that is how we accomplish this thing feeling like it just switches back and forth from on and off very quickly, as we would set both of these to force redraw and then set up our conditions. And then each time the player activates one, as long as the pressing of that is what's actually going to change whatever the conditions are pointed to, and I'll explain all this in just a second. But basically, we can arrange for it to go to toggle back and forth in what feels like real time, which is what feels the best to me in the game. So let's start by conditioning these so that they can actually toggle back and forth. And I'm going to go ahead and fill out this for completion's sake. And then we'll show you how we actually do the work to make the conditions actually change so that something actually happens. So what I like to do for these is use globals. And you will find anybody who's an old school Bethesda modder, anybody who modded a lot of their earlier games, will generally point you away from globals. They'll tell you that they're kind of the devil, you should avoid them. And a lot of that is holdover from older parts of the engine, because the engine has been around for a long time. It's been on many platforms, on older computer systems when memory was more of a limitation. Now globals represent such a tiny, tiny fraction of memory that I find for a lot of things, they're just the right tool for the job. And for settings in a mod, they're especially the right tool for the job, because often with settings, you need to use them in a bunch of different locations. And that is where globals are perfect. When you need to have a lot of different systems in the game being able to access the same piece of data, that's when globals are going to be useful. So often in programming, you want to keep variables as local in scope as is practical. And then in this case, I find that a global is just really appropriate. So a global, when you set it up, it works very much like a variable we set up in a script, where you're basically telling something to hold a number, is effectively what you do with a global. So we're going to go to the global section here, and that is under miscellaneous and then global. And we're going to go ahead and right click and press new. And you can see the global screen is very simple. Basically, you just have an ID field, and then you have a value, and then you have this constant checkbox, and that's it. So because really what it's all about is just holding some number in a central spot that a bunch of different things can access. Now, there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with this. You can have your scripts talk to this and change it. You can access it via the condition system, which is what we're about to do. And you can even even other mods could parent to yours and tap into your globals, and then they could dynamically change things based on what this value is. So it's a lot harder harder to do that with a script, whereas if you have some sort of value in your script, we've talked about having variables and scripts in some of the other lessons, and those are very difficult for other mods to access without having access to your source code. And whereas globals are a very simple way that any mod, DLC, the main game, etc., can all talk to one another fairly simply. So you would effectively fill this out as you'd expect. You'd type in your prefix and then some name for the global. So in our case, we will just call this toggleable demo global. You can name these whatever you want, and it's just something that you'll remember what this is actually representing. Then the value that you fill in here is the default value. That's what it's going to start at. So for ours, we're going to type in 1. We want this to start out as on, which is so this is something that's completely arbitrary, but it's common in computer science to represent on as a 1 and off as a 0. And I'm going to follow through with that. Realistically, there's nothing preventing you from doing it in any other form, because these on off aren't some official thing. We just typed that in. We could even change the name. We don't have to call it on off. We could call it yes, no, or anything like that. So we're going to just follow the standard computer science model of 1 is kind of a positive and 0 is a negative or a non-existent thing. So we're going to follow that format and assume that anytime we have something that's toggleable, we'll use 1 as true, 0 as false, and that will just be a good pattern to follow. And I recommend you guys do the same, because then other people will understand what's going on with your mod if they start trying to dink around and play with your settings. So then lastly, the field on this global is constant. This is a pretty narrow use case. Generally, what you use that for is if it's some sort of information that you need to access in multiple locations, but you don't want it to ever change during gameplay, but you might need to change it via patches later. So for example, a lot of mods use this for version control. So something like if you played Sim Settlements, you'll see up in the corner when you update Sim Settlements, you get a little quick message in the corner that says Sim Settlements successfully updated to version blah, 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 and it'll have the number up there. And that's how this is done, is we use a constant so that number is only changed when we change it in the creation kit or in Xedit, and it's never going to be changed dynamically. Now, if you don't check in constant, so if we didn't check in constant and then say we released our mod and then we decided, you know what, I want this to default to 0, and so we changed this to 0, it wouldn't actually affect anybody's existing game. So the only way to affect an existing game is to check in constant, but the downside of constant is that you then can't update it dynamically after the game starts. So you have to generally, if you are going to have a variable that might be changing throughout a single person's game, you tend to leave it as not constant, and then you use scripts to change it. And then if it's something that you never want to be able to change in real time, you only want it to change between versions of your mod, then you would check in constant. So I'm going to actually cancel here and not create this, because I've actually already got these created, and I'm just going to reuse the ones that I've already used for the demonstration. This terminal that I'm actually creating here is just a copy of one I already have in here, and I'll just delete it before I release it as part of the mod. And so I've got the one that you saw in game already done, and that's probably the one that I will include in the companion mod that is available on Nexus for you guys to download with this lesson. All right, so we're going to set up our conditions now, and you can see I've got my 2 globals already set and ready to go. So we're going to go ahead and go down to conditions here. So we've got our first option selected. So you have to, whatever item you have selected, whether it's a menu item or a body text item, that's what the item conditions section is going to be applied to at that moment. And then we're going to right click down here and hit new. And then this is a window that's immensely complicated, and I mentioned before, it's something we'll cover a lot of times. I'm not going to try and explain the whole thing right now. Instead, I'll just keep showing you examples in various videos, and then we'll talk about the specific fields that are relevant to that. Because basically, the way this works, I will give you the high-level overview, is you first select some sort of condition function. You're asking the game, like, tell me if this thing is true. And then you can use this box to filter it down, to narrow down, because there's just hundreds of options in here. So you can type in part of a name here to shrink this list to make it easier to search. But effectively, whatever you select in here then changes a lot of what these do, and sometimes which of these boxes are actually unhighlighted. So I find it not particularly useful to try and go through each of these because they have different uses depending on what's selected in this box. So we're going to go ahead and go to get global value. Let's see here, get global. And this is one of those points where we could have typed in, say, the word global here to narrow this down, but I'm just going to find it manually. And then that allows this invalid here to select one of our globals. So we'll click on that, and we'll just start typing in this list, kgdt, and there's our toggle option. We'll hit OK. So now it's saying is get global value, that whatever value we have selected here. So is this value equal, and you saw in my previous scripting lessons that equal is a common thing in programming to mean is this exactly the same as the thing on the other side of it, as opposed to if it were a single equal sign, you're saying set the thing on the left to equal the number on the right, whereas two equal signs means you're testing, is this equal to that? And so we're going to check, is this equal to 1? And that's what we want here because, like I said, we're using 1 to represent on. So if this toggleable option is 1, then you should display our toggleable option on. Now, for our off, what we want is this global equal to 0? And that way, these two, since their conditions are on the same exact global, that global can never be both 1 and 0 at the same time. We're not dealing with quantum mechanics here. It's either going to be 1 or 0, which means that only one of our options will ever appear at the same time. So that's perfect. That's exactly what we want to happen. So there is a cool thing we can do. We don't actually have to go through that global and hit new again. We can actually right-click on this other one and hit copy condition, and then come back in here and paste this condition. And now all of this is all filled out for us, and we just have to change the one thing we want to be different, which is the value to be 0. And there we go. So now if we were to load into game, this wouldn't actually do anything because we haven't set this up to change this global in response to them activating it, but we would find that only toggleable option on is shown, and this one would be hidden. And that's because our toggleable option defaults to 1, and we have this condition set looking to make sure that that's 1. So the next thing we need to do is make it so that clicking on clicking on the on version will change the toggleable option to 0, and then when you activate the toggle option off, it should change the value back to 1, and that will give the player that feeling that it's very snappy and turning the thing back on and off. Now, before we can actually do any of that work, we need to press OK on our terminal to save it. If we were to try and start messing with fragments here, creating them and doing some of the renaming that I'm going to show you to do to help keep your fragments organized, you can actually crash the creation kit. So it's best to, before you attach scripts to anything, it's generally best to just hit OK on the form and make sure that that form gets saved. So we're going to do that now. And we're going to say, yes, create new form, because we don't want to overwrite the default terminal. So now I'm going to bring up my kgdt, and you'll see that there's several here because I already have one that I used for the demonstration in-game. And like I said, I'll delete one of these before we release this so you guys aren't confused about which is which. All right, so in previous scripting lessons, I have mentioned that I hate fragments. I think that they're a very big problem, but they're unfortunately a necessary evil. And for those of you who don't love scripting, they're actually a great boon. They're a lot simpler to do than full scripts. The biggest reason I don't like them is because they create code that's tough to find. It's hard to remember if you have something happening. Sometimes having fragments, especially when you get into building complicated quests, that having a lot of fragments everywhere can make it difficult to track where problems are, because then your code is kind of scattered in all these little tiny files. And it's also a case that it's very easy to forget to package the wrong fragment, and then you can create bugs in your own mod or bugs in other people's mods. So fragments I find to be very dangerous, and I'm going to show you how you can make fragments your friend and less likely for you to make those common mistakes with them. So the first thing we need to do is to generate any type of fragment. So the actual work we're going to do is going to require us to set up a property so that we can get access to these globals. But for the sake of just generating the fragment, we're going to just type in any valid piece of code. So that could be something as simple as int x. That technically is a valid piece of code. We're basically declaring a new variable, which we talked about doing in the earlier scripting lessons. And then you just click compile. And this will generate the fragment file. And now we'll be able to do a few more things. We'll be able to set up properties correctly. And more importantly, we will be able to set up a namespace for this. But once we first create a script, before we can do this next step, we actually have to hit OK again to close this window out so that it once again saves. This is a weird thing you often have to do in the creation kit. So if you find random things just don't seem to be working immediately, or if you find that the creation kit is crashing after you do something, often hitting OK on a form after a change you make and then saving your plugin and then coming back and trying again is all that you needed to do. And with the fragments, that is definitely the case. So if we had clicked on this advanced before hitting OK there, these would likely have been grayed out. So that's why we want to do that. So what we're going to do here is we're going to hit rename script. And we're going to add, in front of Fragments terminals, we're going to add our namespace. So whatever you decided to name yours, mine on this is deployable turrets. And then we'll add another colon. And now what this is going to do when we press OK is this is going to move our fragment from the Fragments terminals directory, and it's going to create a new Fragments terminals directory inside of our folder, which the namespace, as I mentioned in the earlier lessons, the namespace is basically just a glorified name for a folder. And basically it'll set up these special versions of these underneath our folder, so that way our terminal fragments are nicely organized underneath our namespace. And I like to make sure I do this every time before I even get started with typing in the actual fragment. That way I know now I get in the habit of that. My script is safely somewhere where I'll never forget to package it, because I can, when we get to creating the BA2 files, which if you watched that particular lesson, you'll see that it's very easy, just drag and drop folders, is that we'll know that dragging, dropping our script folder for deployable turrets will grab all of our fragments as well. So I highly recommend you guys do that way as well, as just get in the habit of renaming and putting it right into a namespace so you don't lose track of it. All right, so now our Papyrus fragment, we are ready to set up properly for what we want to do. So what we're basically trying to do here is we're trying to set up this global so that it changes. So to do that, the first thing we need is we need to set up a property so that our fragment can actually access this global, because you cannot access any forms in the creation kit without setting them up as a property or doing some complicated coding, which I'm going to show you a demo of in a bit, but we're not going to do it for this particular tutorial, or for this part of the tutorial. But there is actually a way to access forms in the creation kit without setting up those properties, though it's something most people won't bother to do because it's complicated. So so we're going to go ahead and go into the properties window, and we're going to click add property here. And from this window, we're going to find global value, or global variable. I can't remember which it's called. Let's see here, global variable. And then you could generally type in any name you want here and then fill it out. But if you actually just select this and then select it again, you'll make it so that you can access the text. And we're just going to copy that. And we're going to change the name to just be exactly the name of the actual editor ID. And what this will end up doing is when we push OK here, it will automatically fill out our property to point at the one that has that exact name. So that's a really cool little trick. And you'll see that Bethesda uses that pretty religiously. They tend to do all of their property names that are meant to point at a form. They will just name them exactly the same as the editor ID, so that they don't have to bother having to fill them out. And I think that's especially useful when because they're working in team environments and they don't want to get mixed up about what's supposed to get filled in and what. If you look at my code, I am horrible at this. I always tend to do, I'll do property names as one thing, and then when I get around to creating the editor ID, I do it something different. And so some of my stuff would be a mess for somebody else to decipher, which is not a good habit. So I recommend just following Bethesda's method. I think they've come up with a good reason to do it that way. It's just it's a lot cleaner and just makes it easier to work in groups on this stuff. All right, so then we're going to press OK here. And now we are ready to change that global with our fragment. So we're going to go ahead and delete out this int x we put in as a placeholder. And we're going to just paste in this global name again. And then we're going to type in a dot. And we're going to type in set value int. And then a left parenthesis. And then we're going to change this to. And then we're going to tell it what we're going to send it to. And then what we're going to set the value to, and then a right parenthesis. So as you guys saw in our previous lessons, this should be a very simple thing to understand. The thing on the left is we're using the dot notation to call this function on it, set value int, and then our argument is 0. So we're setting the value of this global to a 0. Now you can also use set value instead of set value int. I like to use set value int when I'm sending in a single number as opposed to one with a decimal. It doesn't really matter. You could send a 0 with set value, but if you were to try and set value to 1, which we're going to have to do instead of set value int, it would give you an error and it would force you to type 1.0. So I just find it better this way, and I'm betting that there's actually some sort of under the hood benefit to using set value int. Otherwise, they wouldn't have bothered to define this. They would have just told their programmers to just go ahead and just add the 0.0. So my assumption is that there's probably some sort of benefit to this, and so that's how I've started using it. So now you'll see that here I just typed it in wrong. I typed it in 1. So what we're looking at here is we want, when the on option is shown, we want, when the player clicks it, we want it to change to off. So since we know that off shows up when it's equal to 0, we need our script to make a 0 here. So we'll type that in there and we'll hit compile. And now this is set up correctly. So now when they click on, that's going to call this fragment, which will set the value to 0. And then that will cause forced redraw, which will then reevaluate the conditions on all these. And it will see that now off is correct. Now, if we just loaded this into game, what would happen is the first time you pressed it, it would set the value to 0. The off would display. And then if you clicked on off again, nothing would happen because we need to set a corresponding fragment on the off side. So we're going to just copy paste our code here. And this time we're going to change it to a 1. Now you'll notice I didn't bother setting up the properties again, and that's because everything in a terminal entry will share, all of the fragments will share the same properties. So we don't have to keep setting it up the same time over and over again for a single terminal. Now, if we created a sub-menu terminal, which we're going to do in a minute, you would actually have to go reset up the properties again for that. So keep that in mind. So we'll go ahead and compile that. And so now we've got this one is going to, when they click off, it's going to change that value to 1. When they click on, it's going to change it to 0. And that's going to have the effect of making it toggle back and forth. So now the final thing we're going to talk about before we go do the submenu is how exactly this is useful. Because really all we've done right now is set it up so that they can change a global back and forth, and all the global's job is to display this information. Well, this is the beauty of globals, is we could set up this global to be accessed inside of one of our scripts, and then we can make that react to certain things. So for example, in our deployable turrets mod, we have it set up so that when you drop the turret right now, it makes it so that the rotation and everything gets fixed to point forward and fix the thing. We could maybe set up fixed rotation as an option that's on or off. And then the player would get to choose whether or not that happens. And then in our code where we check to see, where we check to reset the position, we could do something like, if toggleable option equals 0, then skip this block of code. And so that's how you can take these settings that you're setting up in a holotape and tie them into various features of your mod and make it so that those change things. And those can be done in code. You can use them in other conditions. For example, we could set up our crafting record. So we have, so let's just go ahead and bring it up. That's something I can show you visibly. So if we go into constructible objects, oh, I know, you know what? I don't know if I ever set it up in here. This version of the plugin, I must have never set up a buildable. We probably only did it through the console. We must have added it to our inventory. So we're actually going to end up creating a constructible record so that we can make our holotape craftable. So I can actually bring this window up just for the sake of that. But if we brought up a constructible object, now I've shown you guys this in the workshop system, but we could also do it for items that get crafted at different benches, such as the chem bench. And you could set up something like a global condition here so that maybe the player would have a setting to disable the ability to craft your item. So maybe it's something like with our toggleable option is enable crafting of item X, and they could turn that on or off. You would have that same condition here, and now this constructible object would only appear if the value was on. And so those are some of the ways you can use it. There's just basically sky's the limit. And like I said, with the global, the nice thing is that you can access that from anywhere. You don't have to worry about having to set it up as a script or having scripts having all of your different items everywhere have access to that script. It's just nice and easy, and it's globally available. Hence the name global. Okay, so this is set up. This toggleable option would absolutely work exactly as I showed you in the demo. So next we're going to set up that complicated option. So we're going to go ahead and press OK here. And when you'll see that there was a little bit of a delay there, that is when you have a script fragment up there that you forgot to compile. So I must have not clicked compile on the second window. It'll actually compile it again when you hit OK to make sure that the script is good. And so if there was a problem with any of these fragments when I hit OK, instead of it closing out, it would have popped up a warning telling me that there was a problem with my fragments and that I need to fix them. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do normally would be to create another terminal. But for the sake of speeding up this, I am going to just show you my existing one that I have here. So here's our complicated 01 here. And basically we're going to just go over what I have set up here. So the way that I had it set up, as you saw in the game, is that at the top it showed the actual value that the current setting was set at. And the way I've done this is I've set up a bunch of different body text. So you can see it's basically I just copy pasted the same thing, and in each one I just changed the value up at the top. And this way the player can quickly at a glance when they're on that screen see what the current value is when they're making their decision. And then the same way that we conditioned the menu items in the main terminal screen, instead we're going to condition our body text. And so that's all I did. So you can see that each of these has our global here, get complicated option. Is it equal to 1? Is it equal to 2? Is it equal to 3? Is it equal to 4? So our body text is now conditioned, and our menu items instead are not conditioned, because the idea there is we want to be able to, for the player to just see a long list of their options as opposed to having to cycle through a bunch of options, which is a little less user-friendly. So this, for complicated options where you're going to have either a lot of information, like for example, this being 1, 2, 3, 4, I mean, obviously that could have easily been a toggle. That's not a big deal to have to cycle between those. But if you had a particularly large number of items, or if each of these had its own explanation, then this screen can just be better because you can put more of this information all right in front of the player for them to choose from. So essentially you should be able to see what we did here is very easy. We just have our different items, and then we followed the same format of each one setting the option. Now, one of the other nice things about the complicated method that I'm calling it, of having this own subterminal, is it makes the logic a little easier to follow. So you can see here when the player clicks on the first option, we're just setting the value to 1. Whereas if we look at our previous one, we had to kind of do opposites. We had to go from on, you're changing the value to off, and from off, you're changing the value to on. And so sometimes, even to this day, I still will confuse myself on that and make the wrong decisions when I'm setting up these toggleable. And any of you who tries to jump in and make use of my new features in some settlements will know that's a common bug that I end up doing, is I'll screw up the new terminal stuff I add up, because I always forget that to reverse the logic there. So this is another advantage here, is it's just easier for you to follow, as you know that each of these menu items, you're setting the value to match exactly that thing, as opposed to having to set it to match the next thing that you would be doing in this toggleable option. So real straightforward, followed the same thing. I did the exact same thing of I set up a fragment and created it, pressed OK, came in here. You can see I renamed the script and put it under my deployable turbis namespace. So it's all the exact same workflow. It's really just the difference is to get that feel is setting it up so that each of these things does the script fragment to match the corresponding item instead of for the next item. And then we're conditioning the actual body text. We create a lot of copies of the body text. But otherwise, it's the exact same thing. So those are the two ways that you can do those various options. And then once we had our second thing set up, if we wanted this second option to be able to show up on the screen as well, we would go new down here, and we would put in complicated option, and then under our submenu we're going to click here and we'll start typing the name of it, and you can see we have our little submenu there, and that's going to take the player into that second terminal screen. It's going to take them into this one on their Pip-Boy when they push this, and then when they hit back, the game is smart enough to take them back to the last one that they came from in the submenu. And you can go as many layers deep as you like too. So if we wanted to, we could have had each of these entries for the submenu, or for the submenu for this complicated option, could have gone to another submenu with further options, and the game is absolutely capable of handling as many levels deep as you want to go. As far as I know, I haven't really tried. I think I've gone maybe 10 levels deep at one point for something, but as far as I know, there's no limit. Maybe somebody knows of a limit. But I would imagine if you're going so many screens where you're hitting a limit, you're probably not making a very user-friendly experience anyway. All right, so that sets up our terminal entries. You guys now know how to set up globals. And keep in mind, you don't just have to set up globals. You can really do whatever you want. Almost anything you could do in a normal script, you could actually do in these fragments as well. You could also do things like set up a property to point to your quest and then have complicated functions set up on your quest to make them do things. You can set stages on your quest. Really, the sky's the limit. And as we cover more things throughout these tutorials. Eventually, I'll show you some more, some cooler tricks you can do with Settings Holotapes, but this should get you started for most of your uses as far as setting up the terminals. All right, so now the next step is we need to set up the actual holotape. So we're going to go ahead, and I've actually already set this up, and I'm just going to show you mine because there's so few fields. It's pretty easy to show you this, but I'm going to show you the one generally that's best to template from if you're starting your own, and that's Common Holotape. This is the one I recommend most to duplicate because it has the common thing set up. It's got the model set up, it's got the pick up and put down, it's got the preview transform, which those are the 4 fields you tend to want to have to set up, and then it doesn't have any funky scripts that you might have to forget to remove. So this is the one I like to template from. But effectively what we're doing is the same thing we always do. We first set the ID field so it's something unique. Then we name it what we want it to show up as in the player's inventory. And you'll notice that there's a character counter here. Is that this is what Bethesda recommends, is the cap is 24 characters for good display. I tend to find that you can go over by a bit and it's fine, especially because with the weapons in the inventory, with the dynamic naming system, they can get so dang long that it's very rare that 24 characters is ever the full width of your Pip-Boy inventory, so not a problem. You can give holotapes a weight if you like. You can give them a value so they can be sellable. Pick up and put down. I think every single holotape that Bethesda creates uses these same 2 sounds. Theoretically, you could put your own, though it would just be flavor. You could change the model or change the texture. You'll find that a few of these, I believe, like the games have their own. Yeah, they have their own custom model files with textures. You can absolutely create your own texture and custom holotape NIF. A holotape doesn't even have to look like a holotape. It could look like a totally different object because it's just how it looks in the world. So if you wanted to do something like a Nintendo, like the old game boxes for Nintendo games or something, and you wanted to create that as your pickup item for a holotape, you'd absolutely be allowed to do that. The icon field is not used, as far as I know, in Fallout 4. I believe this is a holdover from older games. Preview transform. You generally, if you're going to use the holotape model, you'll leave this as is, and that just determines the scale of the item in the preview of your Pip-Boy. And then lastly, we're going to select terminal. And then we're going to select our main terminal. Now I have my, the one I demoed with, but the one we created in this particular tutorial was this main screen one. So you'll just select that in terminal and you push OK and you're done. It's that holotape's now ready to go. So now the last step is getting this into the player's inventory. So there are 2 ways to go about this that most mods have found. It's up to you how you want to do it. And there's actually there's infinite and real ways to do it, but there's 2 common ways that get done. And one is to create an entry to craft it at the chem station. That's my preference. And then 2 is to just drop it into the player's inventory. So we're going to start with the crafting method. And then I'll show you a script and I'll just go over it quickly for how to drop it into the player's inventory at the right time, because that is a little tricky. And I'll include that full script in the mod resources so that those of you guys who want to template that and use it can do so. But we're not actually going to create it in here for the sake of brevity on this tutorial, which is already quite long. All right, so to create the constructible record, it's real simple. We're going to just go and hit new here. We're going to just type in a name. So we're going to go KGDT and we're going to call it Craftable Settings Holotape. And then under the workbench keyword, we're going to do workbench and we're going to do ChemLab. You could, if you want, you can set up a pickup, put down sound. I'm not going to bother. And then under recipe filters, we're going to look for recipe utility. Then we have to have some sort of required item for the player to have to craft it. So we're going to make it super cheap because this is really just about giving them the access to it. We're not really worried about this being a balance thing. We're going to choose one of the scrap ones. We're just going to make it 1 plastic scrap. And then we're going to find our object here. So now this list has every single object in the creation kit that's loaded right now. So it's best to filter this thing down. And we'll go ahead and go to our demo holotape. And then if we wanted to give them multiple, we could. Obviously, we don't in this case. And here you can type a description. This will show up in the build menu. So we'll type in, let's see, deployable turrets settings holotape, so they can see what it is they're building. And then we would push OK here. And that is it. So now this thing will be craftable at the chem lab. Now, see, this is my preference mostly because After playing with a lot of the Creation Club content and like a mod or load order of hundreds of mods, I found that it can take 15-20 minutes before my game is ready to launch with all the stuff people are dumping in and all these scripts running. So I tend to be one that prefer to do the holotape method or the crafting method. It's also more immersive for a lot of players. So you can break immersion for anybody, and so some people don't care, but for the people who do care, it matters. And then for the people that don't care, they probably also don't care if they have to go craft it, because it's not that much bigger a step with how common crafting is in this game. So I find the crafting just to be the more user-friendly method. But if you want to create a drop this right into their inventory, which I know a lot of mods do, the best way to do that, I find, is to detect the player's world space. And the reason for that is if they're in the pre-war area, so that startup zone, and you drop something in their inventory, it will get wiped out of their inventory when they wake up in the cryopod. So I've created a little script for that, and I believe it's this one here. Here we go. And so this is a lot of busy stuff, and like I said, I'm going to include it, but I'm going to just go over briefly what it does rather than going over in depth. I will likely come back and go over something like this in depth if we ever need to do it again. But up here is just my reusage rights. This is just something I like to copy and paste and into all of my files, just to let people know that it's cool for them to go ahead and reuse it. Just make sure that you give credits. And I also, most importantly, is if I use somebody else's script in it, so some other free resources, I want to make sure that they get recognized in here, and that then if you guys use my script, you then also give them recognition and include their script as well. So this is just a little reminder thing I put in here. Up top, we've got our typical script name line. You'll see that I've created this under a namespace of KG templates. I'll be doing this for any particular script that I add to the toolkit that's going to be downloadable that is not used in any particular mod. And the reason I do this is to make sure you guys remember to put it in your own namespace and make your own version of it. Because if everybody just compiles the version that I put out exactly and uses it, then every mod that used that version, the last one loaded, would overwrite everybody else's. And so then if you decided to make some changes to yours, then you'd end up creating an incompatibility. So I like putting it in something like this just as a reminder. And I also put the reminder right in the tooltip here. So if you were to search up this script in, and actually we'll go ahead and bring this up. And actually, you know what? I think I did between recordings of this, yes, I did actually set it up in here. I actually did set it up to work so that this will be in the demo. But if we were to search up this, so let's go ahead and bring this up. If we were to search this up in the Papyrus Manager, you'll see that there's actually that data that I typed up there will actually show up in a place for an end user to see. So not the player, but other people who are using your script. So this is very useful if you're on a team or if you intend on releasing your stuff as a resource. But if we look at here and we hover over it on the Papyrus Manager, you can see my note there: important, rename your copy of the script. So that line here in these curly brackets, you can actually set this up so it'll show up in the creation kit, which is pretty cool. Next up, we did, this is something a little more advanced. I don't think we've talked about this yet in the system, but by adding 2 brackets after the declaration of a variable type in a property, you turn it into an array. And that means that the person using this script can put as many different items as they want in there. So basically, I set this up to be universally useful. You can basically plug in a whole bunch of different items, not just the holotape necessarily, in the creation kit, and then those will get dropped into the player. And then I added an option for give silent. So if you want the thing to just secretly be dropped into the player's inventory without spamming the corner of their screen, which that, again, to me, that if I were to choose a middle ground between the crafting method and the drop in the inventory, I think this is a great middle ground of at least not showing the player the message up in the corner, which those get really obnoxious, of just instead it ends up in their inventory. So when they open it, it'll be there, but you're not breaking their immersion into the game world by having a message pop up in the corner. And so that's an optional setting. So these are our 2 properties that will show up in the creation kit. Next, we have something where I'm doing that's a little bit more complicated. And this is a way you can get access to data that's defined in the creation kit without actually setting up a property. And the reason I did this is because I didn't want you guys to have to, when you're using this script, have to keep setting up this pre-war world space. So like I said, we're going to try and detect when the player is outside of this pre-war space. So what I've done is I set up a variable, and this is a global variable in my script called world space, prewar world space. And then inside of my onQuest init, and this is an event, this will happen automatically when a quest starts. And what I've done here is I basically use this special function called game.getForm from file, and it allows you to load any form that's available in your plugins or in the game that's loaded right now. You can load it based on this form ID, and you basically skip the first 2 digits. And you replace those with, and this is why it's getting complicated, and I'm just going to go over this once. We'll go into it in more detail later, but you replace those first 2 digits with 0x00. Don't ask me why. That's just what you do. And then you put the last 6 there exactly as you see them in the creation kit. And then you plug in the plugin name that it's coming from. And then you have to do a casting. And I think I covered casting briefly in the last thing, but you have to tell it what type of form it is you're loading. And then that will work just the same way as if you had set it up as a property. So now I was able to basically set up this to get access to something that's in the Fallout 4 files without you guys having to set up this property when you go and reuse my script. So this can be pretty useful for things that you're redistributing, where you don't want to have the end user have to fill out all this junk that is going to likely cause confusion or just be an extra bit of work. So next we call this function called try to give items. And you'll see that I also do it in event on player teleport. Now, one thing to know with on player teleport is on player teleport will not trigger by default. You have to register for this. And again, we're getting into very complicated stuff. This tutorial is meant to focus on the settings holotape and the fragments, so I'm not going to get into all this yet. But I will go over this sort of thing later because these are things I use all the time in my coding. But effectively what we're doing is we're saying try to give items, and then the reason I call it try to is because we can't guarantee we're going to give them, but we're going to grab the player's world space. So what world space are they in? If they're in the pre-world war space, or if for some reason we didn't get a world space back, so that could happen if the player, if this ran when the player wasn't loaded for some reason or some bug happened, what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you know what, register for the player to teleport, because once the player teleports, it generally is going to mean they're out of the pre-war world space. That's the first time that the game will teleport them. And then so when teleport triggers, it will try it again. And then every time they teleport until we finish, it's going to keep trying to give them the items. And if the world space does not equal, so if it fails this check, it doesn't equal pre-war world space, and it also doesn't equal none, then that means they're probably in some other world space. They'll be in the Commonwealth, or they're in Nuka World or Far Harbor, and in that case, we want to give them the items. It's safe to give them the items. They're done with the pre-war area, wherever they may be. So then we unregister for the player teleport so that this doesn't keep firing all the time. We grab the player, and then we're using a while loop, and I don't recall if we've covered these. Again, this is all stuff we'll cover again in future tutorials, but we're going to looping through this give items array, and we're just dropping one of these in the player's item or in the player's inventory with the add item function. And you can see we did AB equals silent is the give silent. So we're taking advantage of this property option we have set up, and we're sending it to the AB silent argument. And the reason we're doing that, we're doing AB silent equals, is because we skipped a couple of parameters, which we covered that in the last scripting lesson. So that's this. I'm going to go ahead and include this exactly as is. To use it, all you do is you create yourself a quest. And you can use basically the default options. You just set up an ID. I like priority 40. There's no particular reason to do. The priorities have to do more with when it's resolving dialogue conflicts. So the priority is not, it doesn't particularly matter for this. It also can have an impact on packages. But 40, I feel like, is just a number I see a lot that Bethesda uses, so that's what I tend to use. You would check that in as start game enabled and run once, and that way this will automatically start up as soon as the player loads your mod. Once you set those two, you just hit OK. Then you'll load your quest back up. You go to the scripts tab and then add this script that I have, which you'll end up putting it inside of your data scripts source user folder, and you're going to put it in your own folder and do the thing I've showed you with the script manager, where you're going to change the name of it and compile it from here, and then it will be eligible to add it on here. And then when you double click on that, you'll see that there's this give items, and we could just keep adding as many items as we want because it's an array. And then you can also change whether or not you want it to be silent or not. So That's the quick and dirty on that. I just wanted to go over that part briefly because it's not particularly important, and I don't particularly love when people do this option, but I'm sure most of you guys can figure it out from there based on the previous lessons we've done. So hopefully that was informative and useful to you guys, and you can now go forward and create some holotapes that are pretty user-friendly and easy to give access to them to do changes to your mod.